Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining Ontario Nature's webinar on birding for Atlas-3 and candidate protected areas. My name is Leslie Rudy. I am the Nature Network organizer for Ontario Nature, and I'll be moderating the meeting today. Please note that this meeting is recorded, and the recording will be shared after the webinar if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others, but your faces do not appear. Please feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourself, your organization, and where you're joining us from. Also use the chat for any technical questions you might have. And for questions, please put those in the Q&A function. Our Protected Places coordinator, Jenna Cardoso, will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A and will do her best to answer questions as they come up. If there is time at the end of today's talk, the speakers will take questions then. And if your question doesn't get answered then, you will be invited to email us and we can get back to you with answers to your questions then. So thank you again for joining us today. I will now pass it over to Kristen Setala, who is Ontario Nature's Community Science Assistant. Thank you, Kristen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm just trying to get my camera started here.
Kristen, if you scroll over on your screen, do the settings appear in the bottom?
No, I think it's at the top here. 1 minute. Oh, here we go. Okay. Hello. I'm glad we got that to work. Thanks, Leslie, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm so glad to see that we have people joining from all over. So we'll get started here. So I just want to go over what the webinar will look like today. So we're going to start with some background information on the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas and Ontario Nature's Protected Places campaign, after which we will hear from Franco Mariotti on conservation efforts happening at Wolf Lake, followed by myself sharing stories from the field, traveling to different candidate protected areas around the province. So if we have time for questions at the end, like Leslie said, we will get to those as well. And I just would also like to say, as a bit of a disclaimer, we are covering a lot of topics today in a limited amount of time. So I will do my best to provide sufficient background information for the projects and conservation groups we'll be talking about. But I do recognize there's a lot more to know than what I'm sharing. So my colleague Jenna will be sharing links in the chat as we go. All right, so with that being said, I will start with a land acknowledgement. I'm presenting from Thunder Bay, which was built on the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation. Here we are signatories to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850 on Anishinaabe territory. And I also acknowledge that Métis peoples have ties to and are caretakers of these lands as well. Indigenous peoples have always recognized stewardship responsibilities and continue to be leaders and land defenders to this day across Turtle Island, from Grassy Narrows in Northern Ontario to the Wet'suwet'en Nation in British Columbia. In the context of protected places, we must ensure that free, prior, and informed consent is at the forefront of our minds and actions. And we must also support Indigenous leadership in the selection and management of those protected areas. Throughout the webinar, we will be traveling around Northern Ontario and through different treaties, which I will share as we go. So, a little bit about myself. I was born and raised here on the shores of Gitchgumi or Lake Superior. So Northern Ontario is very near and dear to my heart. I've been a bird lover for all my life and have experience working in wildlife rehabilitation and volunteer bird banding. I've been with Ontario Nature for nearly a year as their community science assistant, working on several projects, mainly the breeding bird Atlas. And I am extremely grateful for the opportunities to connect with so many amazing people and places throughout my time with Ontario Nature and to share some of my experiences with you today. So let's get started with a poll. We've got 2 questions to share with you here, just so I can kind of gauge a little bit about everybody's relationship to birds and the Atlas. So we will get it up going in here any moment. So the first question, the first question is, how would you rate your level of knowledge about birds from beginner to expert? Kind of anticipating we'll have all sorts here, which is what it's looking like so far. I might give it another 10, 15 seconds there for everybody. It seems like the answers are kind of slowing down a bit. Okay, so it looks like we've got a lot of average and strong birders, some new birders, and a couple experts as well, which is exciting. So we've got all sorts of folks here, which is great. And the second question should be coming up here. I'm just seeing the first question again, Leslie. I'm not sure if we have the second one anywhere.
Just give me a moment. I'm having trouble uncovering that.
Okay, I see it now. So the second question, if you can see it, is have you participated in the 3rd Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas? Give it a couple more seconds there. So it looks like nearly everyone has voted, and we've got about 80% saying no, 20% saying yes of those who answered. So we've got a lot of people who haven't participated, which is great. So you'll learn a little bit about that today. That should be good. We will get started. Thank you, everybody, for answering those questions. All right, so for those of you that don't know, the Breeding Bird Atlas, or Atlas-3, is a partnership between 5 organizations: Birds Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Resources and Forestry, Ontario Field Ornithologists, and Ontario Nature. It is a province-wide project that is mainly driven by volunteers. And the aim of the project is to document the relative abundance and distribution of the nearly 300 breeding birds in Ontario. So it's a massive project, and it's the 3rd of its kind, and they've been happening every 20 years since 1981. So this is why I'm referring to it as Atlas-3. So the data collected from the Atlas has many uses, including research and conservation. It is extremely valuable data for guiding environmental policies and conservation strategies. As this is the third breeding bird atlas, comparing the data to previous atlases can give important insight into changes such as relative abundance, species distribution, and significant breeding areas. And the photo that you see on the right is an example of a relative abundance map of a least flycatcher. So the data gets published into this large book. That's why it's called an atlas. So the book is filled with these maps and some text on breeding biology and background on the birds. So it's pretty cool. So this is my first year participating in the Atlas, and I can say personally, it's been a really amazing way to connect with birders all across the province. It's also a great opportunity to learn more about birds and their breeding behavior, and improve your bird identification skills, pardon me, especially sound identification. For experienced birders, it's also a great way to contribute in a meaningful way to bird conservation. So if you're not already involved and you're a birder, I would highly recommend getting involved. And I think Jenna just linked to the Breeding Bird Atlas page in the chat as well. So why is it important to study birds? Well, in 2019, the North American Bird Conservation Initiative published a report outlining the state of Canada's birds. So this photo is taken from that. As you can see, waterfowl and birds of prey were shown to be recovering due to conservation initiatives and recovery strategies. Wetland conservation was one of the notable areas that demonstrated successes in allowing waterfowl to recover, especially. And as you can see on the right, aerial insectivores, such as swallows and swifts, grassland birds, and shorebirds were documented to be rapidly declining. Some major threats include habitat loss due to development, pesticide use that has a negative effect on insectivores and grassland birds, and climate change and rising sea levels. So the recovering birds really goes to show that conservation efforts do work. And birds are also a really great environmental indicator. So they can tell us a lot about the health of our ecosystem. So just another reason why it's important to monitor them. There was also a report released this year by BirdLife International on the state of the world's birds. So it's a bit more broad that we will link to as well from Jenna right there. All right, moving on. An important campaign that is ongoing is Ontario Nature's Protected Places campaign. As you may know, Canada has committed to protecting 25% of lands and waters by 2025 and 30% by 2030. And Ontario Nature is working to ensure that these targets are met. So we are working with industry partners, with nature network groups, Indigenous communities, and local partners to identify opportunities and move towards permanent protections. As you may have seen from our Protected Places webinar last year, we launched a story map, which is pictured here, that shows an overview of different opportunities shared by partners across the province. So some of these opportunities include Indigenous protected and conserved areas, Forest Stewardship Council designated conservation lands, provincially significant wetlands, and expansions of existing protected areas. And as I share stories from fieldwork, you will see examples of these. So one large opportunity for expanding protected areas in the province are FSC certified designated conservation lands. As you may know, forestry companies who manage FSC certified forests must ensure at least 10% of the forest is protected. And currently there are 147 of these sites, totaling nearly 1 million hectares. And this is a little photo here, so you can see them spanning across Northern Ontario. So this is a really great opportunity to help meet those protections targets. And even if you've never heard of FSC, you've probably seen their little logo on paper you've bought or toilet paper or things like that. So we know that protected areas are important for several reasons. They provide safe haven for wild plants and animals, including species at risk. They aid with resilience to climate change, which we've been exploring through our nature-based climate solutions. And they can, of course, also improve our health and well-being by providing spaces where we can connect with the environment around us. And they can also strengthen and sustain Indigenous knowledge and value systems. And during a time where we are experiencing a dual crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss, the importance of protected areas is evident. So now I have the pleasure to introduce Franco Mariotti, a biologist and an amazing storyteller who is going to speak about conservation efforts at Wolf Lake.
Thanks very much, Kristen. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. All of you I know can appreciate that there's many beautiful and special places across the province. This is just one of them, Wolf Lake. So you're going to be seeing with my finger up, that's for Kristen to move forward. I first want to recognize that Wolf Lake is located in the Wanapate First Nation territory, which is just east of Sudbury. And I also want to recognize these 4 photographers, but especially Rob Nelson, of which a good half of the photos in this presentation are his. So where's Wolf Lake? Well, if we look at a satellite image of Sudbury, those rectangles identify the city of Greater Sudbury. I don't think many of you realize that Sudbury is 4,000 square kilometers in size, bigger than Algonquin Park. It is the 5th largest municipality in Canada. And if you look at the northeast corner of the city and focus more into this square, you will see that funny shaped lake, which looks like the silhouette of a wolf, as if it's howling, hence the name Wolf Lake. There it is there. So I'm just going to show you a few photographs of what the area looks like. So why is this area so special? Well, all you have to do is climb a hill near Wolf Lake and look around, and you realize very quickly that most of the trees you're looking at are red pine trees. The majority of the forest, well over 65%, are made up of red pine. And if you look closely, many of these trees are old growth, which means that they are at least 140 years and older. Now, Dr. Peter Quimby, a retired biologist from Trent University, a few years back was commissioned to do a study of all of the old growth red pine forests remaining in Canada and in the United States. And he discovered out of all of these sites, Wolf Lake, which was 1,600 hectares, for those of you who are like myself, appreciate acres, that's a little over 4,000 acres, is by far the largest remaining old growth red pine, bigger than anywhere else, more than 600 hectares. So if you were to go to Wolf Lake and walk from the shoreline and into the forest, what you see very quickly are red pine of all different ages, some just a few years old, some 50, some 100, some 150, all the way up to 300 plus years old, which means and tells us that this forest is self-sustaining. And if you look at some of the old red pine, you very quickly begin to realize that many of these have survived ground fires during its life. In fact, one tree cookie, which is a disc taken from a pine tree, one that we analyzed, which was 240 years old, survived 5 ground fires. And if you look at these trees from a distance, they kind of look a bit odd than other trees. You know, this one, for example, I'd say looks more like the mast of a ship, of an old sailing ship. And really what you're looking at is an adaptive feature of this tree species surviving in a fire ecosystem. What they do is tend to slough off the lower branches as the tree grows older. And the reason for this, at least biologists surmise, is that as a ground fire moves through, it cannot climb the tree to get at the canopy, which would kill the tree, because there's no lower branches for it to climb up the tree. And so the fire just moves through very quickly. When you look at some of these trees, when we talk about 300-year-old trees, many of you may think of very large diameter trees. Well, at Wolf Lake, they're not that large. So if you look here on the picture on the right, Dr. Peter Beckett from Laurentian University, he's standing beside a red pine that is nearly 270 years old. And the reason why it is not humongous, sort of speaking, is because many of these pines are growing in very poor nutrient, shallow soils. And probably one of the reasons why red pine dominates here over white pine. A core, of course, of that tree revealed the actual age. And that's how we know. But honestly, a lot of research still needs to be done for the area. Occasionally, though, you do come across some very large diameter trees. This is really an old white pine tree. And by the way, that hand on the left is not from the same person on the right. So it gives you an idea how large of a diameter this pine tree would be. Now, for the past century, Wolf Lake has been acid dead because of the smelting operations from Sudbury and the acid rain because of the release of sulfur from the smelting operations. But since 2015, now 7 years ago, fish have started returning to Wolf Lake. These are all native fish that used to be in the lake decades ago and are now actually reproducing on their own. So much so that MNRF designated Wolf Lake 2 years ago as a lake trout reserve because it is so special, and they're studying to see how these fish are returning on their own. So where are we now? Well, since 1999, when Ontario government did the Lands for Life program, designating parks and land uses, Wolf Lake was identified as a special area and has become a park in waiting. That is their words. And the reason why it's a park in waiting, if you look at this map, all of the green is currently a waterway park. We call it the Chinaguchi Canoe Area. But if you look at where Wolf Lake is on the left side in the center, that yellow area, that's where Wolf Lake is. Like a missing link in a longer chain, Wolf Lake has been removed from the park system solely because of mineral exploration. And that is what's blocking any further reserve or protection for Wolf Lake. You've heard about this program that the federal government introduced when the Liberals came into power a few years ago. 30% of the land base and marine base of Canada to be protected by 2030. And of course, the interim program is 25 for 25. So Ontario Nature, along with other provincial organizations such as Earthroots, Friends of Topogamy, quite a few naturalist clubs and individuals, all want Wolf Lake to become a candidate on that Protected Spaces campaign. So in summary, why protect Wolf Lake? Wolf Lake really is the only place in the greater city of Sudbury that tells us what Sudbury looked like before the railroad came through here in the 1870s, just after Canada was created. That's one reason, for historical reasons. From cultural and recreation, Wolf Lake is highly sought after by canoeists. Many refer to Wolf Lake as the Killarney of the North. From a biological perspective, it is the largest remaining old-growth red pine forest in all of North America. Lastly, from a climate change perspective, we know that old-growth forests store the most amount of carbon. So for mitigating climate change alone, places like Wolf Lake should and need to be protected. So please help save Wolf Lake and help and support Ontario Nature in their Protected Places campaign. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franco. That was great. So I was lucky enough to go to Wolf Lake this summer, and I must say it was as beautiful as Franco had described and just showed us there. So myself and a colleague met with members from the Wolf Lake Coalition and the regional coordinator of the Sudbury area for the Atlas. We discussed the history of the area and the issues around protections of Wolf Lake and conducted Atlas-3 surveys. It was super inspiring to hear from folks who are so knowledgeable and passionate about the area and who have been working tirelessly to protect it, as you just got a taste of from listening to Franco there. So during our 2 days conducting bird surveys, we recorded at least 35 bird species. I'm saying at least because my colleague and I had conducted point counts using a handheld device. So there is a possibility that more birds would have been added had those recordings been analyzed. We had a high diversity of wood warblers when we were there, such as this Blackburnian warbler pictured here. I did not take this photo. I didn't take any of these photos, just so you know, but I just wanted to show you how beautiful the Blackburnians are. We had a pair bouncing around by our campsite, and it was just so fun to watch. We also saw pairs of least flycatchers, yellow-rumped warblers, and common loons who are known to nest on Wolf Lake. And we had also documented fledgling song sparrows, which were our only fledglings that we saw during the trip. So it was really special. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the atlas or point counts, they are standardized counts in a specific location where you count all the birds you see and hear within a 5-minute period. And the atlas organizes the province in 10 by 10 kilometer squares. And to complete the point counts in a square, 25 counts are required, 20 of which would be roadside. So if you can see the little roads here, you can see that these black X's are point counts along the road. And 5 would be off-road in different habitats. So there are no off-road ones marked here on this map, but the full map would tell you which habitats to try to conduct your point counts in, such as coniferous forests or deciduous forests and so on. And this is a very basic explanation of point counts, but as I said, we can link to, or we've linked to the Birds Ontario website, so you can learn more there. So during this trip, we surveyed in 2 squares, one of which only had 2 roadside point counts. So that meant that we had to do 23 of the remaining point counts off-road. So Daryl, the regional coordinator, did an amazing job choosing these sites for us, ensuring they were in the proper habitats and far enough away from each other. But this meant that we basically spent most of our mornings paddling and bushwhacking to several GPS locations, which was a lot of fun and a really good challenge. So we ended up completing the off-road point counts for 2 of the squares up near Wolf Lake. And the biggest challenge for me was the overwhelming amount of mosquitoes. We were told it was going to be black fly season, but the mosquitoes were way worse. And I can't tell you how difficult it is to try to identify bird songs when all you can hear is a constant hum of mosquitoes around your head, especially as someone who is trying to put their bird song identification skills to the test. It was a good challenge, but it was still really beautiful sitting among the pines and listening to the birds and the bugs. As you can see on the right here, this is one of our members wearing his bug jacket, stomping through the forest there. So it was a lot of fun, and I'm glad that we got all those point counts done. So Jenna just linked to the Wolf Lake Coalition's website, so you can visit their website to learn more about them. They also released a wonderful short film last year, which is on YouTube, which is also linked in the chat. So I encourage you to watch that to learn more about this beautiful area. And thanks again, Franco, for chiming in on Wolf Lake. So now we're going to go back in time a bit. and much further north. It brings me back to Robinson Superior Treaty territory and to the big river trip I went on in late May of this year. So I joined the Friends of Wabakimi on an 8-day canoe trip through the big river drainage system between Wabakimi and White Sand Provincial Park. The big river, as it turns out, is quite small, so I don't really know why it was named that, but it's connected to Big Lake, which is actually a big lake, so perhaps that's why. So this is one of our campsites. You can see our nice flag here, and these beautiful little patches were made by a family member of one of our leaders, I believe. So you can see this little circled area here. That was the location we went to. It was about 3 or 4 hours north of Thunder Bay. And zooming in a bit, you can see Wabakimi Provincial Park to the west and White Sand Provincial Park to the east. And we went just north of Armstrong. So we started in Armstrong, got a shuttle up to our starting point from Wabakimi Fishing and Canoe Outfitters. So they dropped us off, and we spent 8 days paddling through this little channel of lakes and rivers here, and ended off kind of almost near White Sand Provincial Park. This is not an accurate map. I made this on my own, but it gives you the idea of where we went. So there were 2 main goals of this trip. The first was to conduct bird surveys for Atlas-3 in 5 Atlas squares, which we would pass through. And these squares were undocumented so far in the Atlas, and this was my main focus of the trip. It wasn't the right time to conduct point counts. It was just before the peak breeding season. So I wasn't necessarily completing any of these squares, but it was good to add some data to the squares for the Atlas. The second goal was to demonstrate and document the use of canoe routes within the Wabadawgang Nuping Forest. There is a new forest management plan in the works, and the Friends of Wabakimi wanted to demonstrate that there are recreational values to be considered, as well as ecological in the context of the birds. So I conducted Atlas-3 checklists during portages, at campsites, and at lunch spots. Basically, whenever we were in one spot on land enough for a long enough period of time, I would do a checklist, or several, depending on the time. Luckily, we had a really amazing group of paddlers, and they were super supportive of the bird counts and definitely pulled some extra weight, maybe cooking and cleaning more while I was out conducting bird counts or putting up this recording unit. So big thanks to them. So yes, pictured here on the right is an autonomous recording unit that the Atlas organizers provided me with, a couple. I would set them up each evening and retrieve them the following day. Either close by our campsite, I would just hike into the forest and make sure I was far away not to catch any snoring or anything. Or I would paddle in the direction that we were going the following morning, drop it off, and then pick it up the next day. So that was the recording unit, and that helped us to record crepuscular birds or birds that were singing more throughout dawn and dusk that I wasn't doing checklists for. And the Friends of Wabakimi are currently working on a project right now to raise money for 10 ARUs to be used by the Wabakimi staff. So we've linked to their website too if you want to learn more about that project. And incidental counts were also done as we went. So these are counts taken while you're not already recording a checklist. These would typically be notable sightings such as species at risk or sightings that demonstrated some sort of breeding evidence, which I'll talk about more in a moment. For example, I wasn't documenting every northern water thrush as that I heard while we were paddling, because that was a species that I would pick up during a typical checklist. And again, I had a wonderful paddling partner, Beth, who was always looking for birds with me and was very patient while I was documenting any counts while paddling. So shout out to Beth for being an amazing paddling partner. Over the course of the trip, we documented 62 bird species. And again, this is not including the recordings from these units. So that was just what I had documented. If you are unfamiliar with the Atlas's breeding codes, you can see some here. So there were confirmed breeding, probable breeding, and possible breeding. So confirmed breeding, we documented Canada jays with fledged young. That's what this stands for. So we saw a couple little juvenile Canada jays getting fed by their mom and really not able to fly super well, which was cute. Common ravens and tree swallows, we saw nests with young in them. And we saw at least flycatcher nest building. I also documented some probable breeding for a bald eagle pair, which is P, and red-tailed hawk, which is D. They were displaying. So they were doing their flight display up in the air. And many of these sightings with higher breeding evidence, such as confirmed or probable, were incidental counts. So for example, we saw these tree swallows, again, not these ones, but we saw some tree swallows as we were paddling along a river, entering a cavity in a dead standing tree. And as we got closer, we could see the little juvenile heads popping out and hearing them calling. So it was a really sweet moment. And the same happened with the common raven too. We could hear the young talking. And over the 8-day trip, we traveled through many diverse habitats. In some mature coniferous stands, some birds that we saw were boreal chickadees, blackback woodpeckers, and American three-toed woodpeckers, and brown creepers, which are an indicator species for mature forests. These were fun sightings for me. I don't usually see many black-backed woodpeckers or American three-toed woodpeckers until the winter time, when you can see the evidence of the three-toed woodpecker flaking off the bark in the snow. That's always fun to see. And the most common species, I would say overall, were ovenbirds. You would probably recognize their teacher, teacher, teacher song. So they were pretty much everywhere as we went. Hermit thrushes, as well as Swainsons and Veeries were common. I had already mentioned the northern water thrush. This was definitely one that I heard a lot. We would see it either along the riverbanks or along the sides of the lake. Really cute, bobbing up its tail. And the white-throated sparrow, as you're probably familiar with, they have the classic "Oh, Sweet Canada, Canada, Canada" song. And ruby-crowned kinglets, who are very tiny but have a very loud song, and they were singing almost constantly throughout the trip. So that was definitely a common bird to see. Not all the most flashy species, but it was late May, so some of the warblers were still showing up. We did see some really nice warblers as well. I also documented a couple species at risk, including common nighthawks, who are crepuscular birds, and I heard them calling one night before bed, so that made sense. We also saw olive-sided flycatchers, actually just one olive-sided flycatcher, perching on the top of a dead tree as we paddled. And we had several sites with Canada warblers singing and hopping around in like the low-lying kind of wet areas. And it was my first time seeing Canada warblers, so that was really exciting for me. So one of my favorite things about this trip was the timing. Every day there were new buds springing up and the trees were slowly turning from brown to this beautiful chartreuse green. It was also wonderful for birds because it seemed every day there was a new bird arriving that we could hear. And one day nearing the end of our trip, Beth and I realized that we hadn't heard a northern parula as we were paddling. And sure enough, within the next hour, we heard one singing. So it was a really fun time to be hearing them all returning up north. And if you live in northwestern Ontario, you will know that we had extremely high water levels this spring. This helped us in some areas. As I said, the big river is quite small, so it was kind of nice to have high waters there, but it also made some spots challenging. From the right photo here, you can see one of our portages. The entrances had been a little bit flooded. And our fearless leader, Vern, wrote our trip report and documented the difficulty level as high. I was really glad to see that he had noted it as high because this was my first multi-day canoe trip. So I'm glad to know that I wasn't the only one who thought it was very difficult. Most of the portages, if not all, hadn't been cleared in several years. There were some that were cleared in 2016 by the Friends of Wabakimi project. But as I said, they probably hadn't been cleared in years. We had to drag our boats over a lot of blowdown and uneven ground since they were too dangerous to carry in some spots. So the area also holds significant ecological, recreational, historical, and cultural value. It's documented to be historic caribou habitat, and we actually did see some caribou scat at one of our campsites on Dalton Lake. It's a haven for keen paddlers, and as you can see by this old blaze to the right, there are several historic portages. For those of you who don't know, a blaze is a notch made in the tree used using an axe to mark the opening of a portage or direction. And these historic ones were actually helpful for us because there were several portages we had to search for. So also, many people use this area for moose hunting. I believe there's some trap lines in the area. And one really neat thing we saw were some pictographs on a cliff face, which was amazing to see. I've never seen one kind of in the middle of nowhere, it seemed. So that was a really special thing to see. And if this trip is enticing to you birders, I would suggest looking into plans for the far north atlasing trips. These will be, from my understanding, much more remote than what I've just described. I believe most of them, if not all, you'll have to fly in for. So if you're interested, you can check out the Birds Ontario website or email Carl Hyde, who is helping plan these trips for the Atlas. And I believe there are 10 trips happening. So that's a really good opportunity to do some exploring in Northern Ontario and put your birding skills to the test. So this is the last trip I'm going to talk about. It's our trip out to the Dryden area in Treaty 3 territory, about 4 hours west of Thunder Bay, where we visited the Farabout Peninsula Farabout Peninsula and Nabish Wetland Complex. So the Farabout Peninsula is a roadless peninsula, about 1,000 hectares, and it is home to mature forests, bogs, and shoreline wetlands. There is great ecological value, including spawning habitat for muskies around these bays. There are several bays, as you can see. Diverse habitat for significant plant and bird species, and it also is home to old growth and mature forests. There is a significant cultural and historic value as well. Along the isthmus here, as you can see, there's just a small connection between this huge landmass and the land. Along the isthmus, there are 2 documented archaeological sites and registered archaeological sites that are documented to be over 2,000 years old. And this place is also a sacred spot for Migizi-Zagaigan or Eagle Lake First Nation, whose community is located just east of the peninsula. And Migizi-Zagaigan has declared the peninsula an Indigenous and protected conserved area due to its significance. Farabout is also located in the busiest area of Eagle Lake, which is known for its world-renowned sports fishing, also has commercial fishing, and several tourism and ecotourism operators. So it holds recreational value as well. The Eagle Lake Farabout Peninsula Coalition is working towards permanent protections and have been for several years. In the 2021 to 2031 Forest Management Plan, it has been protected. The peninsula has been protected, but it doesn't ensure permanent protections. And any future logging would require a road to be built through that isthmus, which is home to those archaeological sites, as I mentioned, and hosts sensitive ecosystems as well. And on the right, you can see this new interpretive sign that the coalition had unveiled last year so that visitors can learn more about the significance of the peninsula. This is located on the isthmus, as it's really the only crossing point on the peninsula other than going all the way around. And it's a big landmass. So yeah, it's a very beautiful sign. This was from our visit there. So some notable birds we saw during our time are pictured here. To the left, you'll see a photo taken by one of our guides, Darlene, of a loon hiding on its nest. We saw it from afar. I wasn't sure if it was alive or not, so it was doing a really good job of staying still and keeping hidden. And its mate was swimming around not too far from us as well, keeping an eye that we didn't go too close. So that was a really neat sighting. And to the right, you can see a beautiful white pine standing tall here. And you probably can't see, but there's an eagle's nest at the top. There were several eagle's nests all around the peninsula, but this one was special because it did have a little juvenile eagle in it, which was really nice to see. And some other notable sightings were of Canada warblers again. This was the Canada warbler site to the left. They were nesting on the isthmus, kind of near the archaeological site. And we were really lucky to have Darlene as our guide because she's really familiar with the area and the birds of the area, so she knew where to find these birds. We also saw a pair of red-necked grebes building a nest along the shoreline out of plant materials. And the second breeding bird atlas shows that these grebes were most abundant in northern Ontario in the Lac-Seul Lake of the Woods region. So it wasn't uncommon to see them here in Dryden, but I have never seen them nest building before, so it was a really special moment. So during our day exploring the peninsula, we saw lots of diverse habitats and species. We went to this beautiful cedar grove, saw some stands of black ash, which is endangered, bur oak, and a lot of beautiful marshes as well. The peninsula is also known to have a high diversity of orchid species, but we weren't there at the right time to see them in bloom, unfortunately. So I'll just have to go back again another time. The next day, Darlene took us to the Nabish Wetland Complex, which is a provincially significant wetland, about 10 kilometers south of Dryden. The wetland itself is protected and has a 120 meter buffer zone around it, but it's still at risk, which I will talk more about shortly. This area holds significant cultural significance, for several reasons, including the wild rice production areas around Rice River, which is a traditional food to harvest. It also provides aquatic feeding areas for moose, as well as nesting and staging areas for waterfowl. There have been several species at risk documented here as well, such as least bitterns and black terns, which are a colonial nesting waterbird. So this day was filled with exciting birds to see, including a Virginia rail here on the right and Wilson snipes. Also, we saw an American bittern, several trumpeter swans, a ringneck duck with a little clutch of babies swimming behind it, which were so cute. And these two in particular were very exciting for me because they were lifers. So for those of you who maybe aren't birders, lifers are birds that you've never seen previously or had positively identified before. And there were actually a pair of Wilson snipes, which was really fun to watch. And again, we paddled through the wetland, and Darlene kind of had an idea of where to find these rails. So we were really lucky to have her there, and it was just a really neat sighting. These ones were seen in a cattail marsh in the wetland complex. Another portion of the complex we visited was Nabish Lake, which was extremely picturesque, as you can see. The white water lilies were blooming here all throughout the lake, and we saw several trumpeter swans. Nelson sparrows were calling constantly, and we saw some common terns flying around, which was really fun. We also saw this dragon's mouth orchid, which I had never seen before, so that was a really cool sighting. And I just want to say many thanks to Dale Darlene and the Eagle Lake Farabout Peninsula Coalition for guiding us and just doing the important work to protect these areas. I just want to note some benefits about wetlands since we're talking about this wetland complex. We know that they are a critical part of halting and reversing climate change and biodiversity loss, among other benefits, such as carbon storage, flood mitigation, water purification, etc. And there is, as I mentioned, there are still threats to Nabish wetlands and provincially significant wetlands in general. So if it passes, the Ontario government's recently introduced Omnibus Bill 23 will significantly weaken protections imparted to ecosystems like the Nabish wetland complex. It will undermine the method for evaluating wetlands as provincially significant as well, which with the likely result that far fewer wetlands will qualify and benefit from policy protection. So for those who are interested in learning more, Jenna just shared a link to an article with more information about the bill. Also, stay tuned for an upcoming Ontario Nature Action Alert, and email invitations and promotions will be circulating shortly for another webinar on November 22nd, which will focus on Ontario Nature's work in wetland conservation and offsetting, including a discussion of Bill 23 and its implications for Ontario's wetlands. So I'd just like to close with this quote from Robin Wall-Kimmerer, a Potawatomi scientist and author. Doing science with awe and humility is a powerful act of reciprocity with the more than human world. I'm sure that many of you would agree that birds are particularly awe-inspiring and humbling creatures. So I hope that this serves as a reminder just to take time to connect with the animals or the lands that we are studying, working to conserve, or just living alongside. So lastly, I would like to acknowledge the financial support of the Government of Canada and their Career Launcher internships. And a very big thank you to all of the groups and partners who supported these trips and who are working to protect these important areas. Just a reminder that the recording link will be sent to you afterwards via email. And after you leave the webinar, a survey will pop up, and I greatly appreciate your feedback on the survey. So I think we have some time.
Yes, thank you both so much for sharing about Atlas and Wolf Lake. We do have 5-6 minutes for some questions. So Kristen and Frank, if anybody has any questions for Kristen and Frank, please start popping them into the chat. I do, there was one question that was asked earlier during Frank's presentation. And it was, do you know which minerals have been identified as potential resources at Wolf Lake?
The answer is none of any significance. They have drilled for minerals at Wolf Lake for over 40 years now, and nothing of significance ever been found. The reason why they're still mineral exploring is that if you realize the way that business works is people invest in the mineral drilling in case they find something. So it's not because they have found something and then a whole bunch of money goes in trying to make a mine. It really is in the hope of finding something. So the way we look at it, they've spent 40 years looking for things in and around Wolf Lake. It's time now to really look at its other great values and assign it protection.
Awesome, thank you. And I also shared, well, not a petition, but a letter that I found on the Save Wolf Lake website that you can send to our leaders to let them know that you want Wolf Lake protected as well. So, Frank, that's what's being sent out right now is a letter. And if you're interested, yeah, pop into that website. I'm not seeing any other questions, but if you have anything else, just lots of thank yous and great jobs. Oh, we got another one. Oh, another thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you all for joining.
Absolutely.
Kristen, do you think the terns were nesting? I didn't see any evidence of nesting, but I believe they had been nesting in that area historically. As well, in the same area, black terns had been nesting there. But I don't think the black terns have been nesting there for several years now. So we didn't document any confirmed breeding evidence for the terns, but they very well could have been nesting there, yes.
Okay, another question that came up is, are you finding any issues with bird communities through the Atlas?
Any issues? Can you repeat that one, Jenna?
Are you finding any issues with bird communities through the Atlas?
Yeah, so basically, once all of the data is compiled, we can see where the birds are most abundant and where maybe they're not so abundant. And comparing that data to the previous atlases, we can see how the changes have happened. Personally, I can't say I've been atlasing for long enough or have enough background information on the particular places where I was atlasing to know whether or not there were concerns. I could say personally, I was kind of expecting to see some more aerial insectivores, like more swallows around. I didn't see too many other than the tree swallows that I had mentioned today. So I would say personally, I can tell that those populations might be not showing up as much, but I can't give any specific examples, honestly. But the Atlas's data is available on their website. So if you're interested in looking up a specific species or anything, you can look up the maps from this last atlas on the website there.
Great. In terms of the Atlas-3 northern trips, Amanda is asking if any skill level can help out with them.
I think that they are looking for experienced birders, just because it takes so many resources to go up there, and you need to have strong paddling experience, but also it's more worth it to have experienced birders so that the best data possible is collected. With that being said, I know that they had previously looked for folks who are just really strong paddlers and have a lot of experience with paddling experience and trips. So you can always check back in with them or just send them an email and kind of gauge your skills at any point. But I would definitely say they're looking for more experienced birders. But the Atlas is a great way to gain that experience. So even if you're not there yet, there's still a couple more years left for the Atlas. There's probably going to be northern trips done each year. So if you start now, you might improve your skill set to join one of those trips eventually.
Very encouraging. We have one last question, and it's 3 o'clock right now, so we'll make it quick. But Kristen, when you bushwhack to a specific GPS location, how long do you need to wait to get an accurate count due to the disturbance?
An accurate count of the birds, I'm assuming they mean?
I'm assuming that as well.
So we would, once we arrived in that the GPS location, we had a handheld recording unit that we were doing point counts with because it was our first time doing these point counts on our own. So we were using this recording unit and counting ourselves as well. So we had to set up the recording unit on like a log or a tree. So that would take a couple minutes, and then we would, yeah, it didn't take very long for us to kind of get settled. And also we were not being very loud or disturbing too much anyways. So I would say as soon as we got to the site, like it would take maybe a couple minutes, and we would just get ready and start the recording and just sit silently, as silently as we could within the mosquitoes for 5 minutes. So yeah, it didn't take very long. It just took long to get to those sites because we were bushwhacking. So
Well, thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Kristen and Franco, for your wonderful presentations and all of those wonderful photos. That was lovely. And thank you for everybody here for attending. It was great. We had a wonderful turnout. If there are any other questions, I did see 1 or 2 coming through in the chat at the last minute here. Please email us and we'll do our best to answer your questions that way. And remember that you will receive the recording afterwards, and that there will be a poll at the end of when the webinar closes. So thank you again, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon.